back with Chapter 18 of The Secret of Shadow Ranch, The Black Phantom. As the watchers stared, amazed, the glowing specks stopped floating forward and hung in the darkness. "Oh," Mrs. Thurman quavered, "they shine just like the ghost horse." Nancy switched on the light. Before them stood Chief, a large rubber ball clutched in his jaws. Smiling at the flabbergasted onlookers, Nancy said, "Do you see how the phantom trick worked?" "I do," said George promptly. "Phosphorescent paint on the dog's teeth." "Where are the specks now?" Mrs. Thurman asked as Chief dropped the ball. "They don't show when the lights are on. At the time Chief disappeared, after he chased the phantom horse, the spots were on his teeth," the young sleuth explained. "I thought perhaps he had bitten the horse, but when I examined him in the daylight, of course I found no evidence." "The gang must have washed him," remarked Bess. "But they never thought of his teeth," Nancy said, "and fragments of the paint remained." "How did you get onto the idea?" Aunt Bet asked. Nancy reminded the others of her suspicion that Chief had been muzzled and taken away because the gang feared there was a clue to the apparition on him. "I learned in chemistry class that phosphorescent paint glows in the dark after it first has been exposed to light," she went on. "I remembered that each time I'd seen the phantom horse, there had been a light in the spring house just before. I put two and two together and decided that the apparition was a real horse. He was covered with a soft, thin material which had been coated with phosphorescent paint and exposed to light in the spring house by one of the gang members." Mrs. Thurman drew a deep breath and turned to Nancy. "You're a downright marvel. That's what you are, young lady." Nancy blushed. "You'll stay now, won't you?" And the others all added their pleas. "Course I will," Mrs. Thurman declared stoutly. "You just show me the varmint that's been doing this no-good trick, and I'll give him a piece of my mind." Before going to bed, Nancy told Aunt Bet and Uncle Ed of her plan for the following day. The rancher assured her that he would cooperate. At breakfast, the girls talked light-heartedly of their all-day horseback ride. "Where are you girls fixin' to go?" Shorty asked. "We'll start up Shadow Mountain," Nancy replied vaguely. "After that, we'll see." Mr. Raleigh broke in to appoint Tex and Bud as the helpers on the treasure expedition. When the meal was over, Nancy took Dave aside and told him that if she and the other girls found Valentine's hoard, they would light a fire on the lookout rock. "Good," he replied. "Then I'll drive down in the valley and the truck and climb up to the cliff houses by the front steps to help you bring the treasure back to the ranch." Half an hour later, Uncle Ed, Tex, and Bud saddled up for their trip. Shorty hung around, eager to help, as two pack horses were led out. One was loaded with digging tools and the other with supplies. "What's the second animal for?" asked Sanders, who had been told the secret. The rancher owner grinned. "For the treasure." The trio headed down the valley away from Tumbleweed. Shorty watched them for a minute, then hurried into the woods behind the ranch house. Strolling toward the stable, Nancy suspected that Bercy and Diamond were hiding among the trees, waiting to see which way the treasure party had gone. In the tack room, Dave helped Nancy pack small digging tools into a saddlebag and roll a spade and a blanket. The cowboy then saddled the girls' horses and slung the gear aboard two of them. Mrs. Thurman brought lunches, which Dave added to a pack as Nancy called to her companions that everything was ready. Before they mounted, Nancy suggested that they cross the big meadow. "We'll ride up Shadow Mountain from there." "But it's in the opposite direction from the cliff dwellings," Alice whispered. "That's the idea," Nancy replied. "Just in case Shorty suspects a trick, and decides to follow us." Dave pulled out a stub of pencil and drew a map for Nancy on the back of an envelope. It showed a trail going east across the mountain to the cliff dwellings. 20 minutes later, the girls were heading up Shadow Mountain. As they jogged along the trail, Nancy studied the map and noted that Dave's route began not far from the cabin. "We can go there first," she said. If the gang is on a wild goose chase, now would be a good time to search for their hiding place. Though the girls were eager to go on with the real purpose, they spent the morning wandering over various trails. "If anyone is following us, I hope he'll think we're just out for pleasure and give up the chase," Nancy remarked. In early afternoon, they stopped beside a stream to eat their lunch and rode straight for the cabin. After half an hour, however, they were brought up short by huge boulders on the path. "A rock fall," George exclaimed. "We'll have to detour." The riders backtracked, then crossed a steep, stony slope, so treacherous that they were forced to dismount and lead their horses slowly. Finally, they reached clear trail again. It was mid-afternoon when Alice cried out, "There's the cabin! I see the roof!" The foursome rode up the slope and ground-hitched the horses. Cautiously, they made their way toward the cabin. The door was open and no one was inside. Nancy led the way behind the cabin and noticed again how close the back window was to the brush screen and rock wall. "What a funny place to put a window," Bess remarked. "Yes, that's one of the reasons I feel sure a hiding place is back there somewhere," Nancy replied. "I think the window was used as an escape exit from the cabin." The girls examined the close-growing chaparral. A few feet to the side of the window, George discovered a break in the thorny brush. Nancy slipped into it, and one by one the girls struggled through and entered a narrow cleft in the rock wall. A few yards inside the opening, Nancy pointed out a horseshoe, paw, and shoe prints. "Let's follow the prints," she suggested. "I have a hunch this path might lead to Valentine's hideout." The girls hurried to their mounts and soon were riding through the narrow pass with only a strip of blue sky visible above them. After a while, even that was blotted out by an overhang. The path grew gloomy and wound sharply around jagged outcrops. By the time the riders saw daylight again, the sun was low in the sky. They rode up a gentle slope and found themselves on a high plateau. Some distance ahead was a long, straight, rocky parapet, about 12 feet high. Nancy reined up sharply. "Look!" she cried out. Built against the wall was a three-sided stone enclosure with an old wooden gate. Inside pranced a handsome black stallion. "The Phantom Horse!" Nancy exclaimed. As the four riders approached, the animal whinnied and reared, backing toward a crude lean-to stable. "Maybe the trick trappings are in there," George said. Nancy dismounted quickly, opened a wooden gate, and slipped into the enclosure. The black steed nickered nervously and shied away, but Nancy talked soothingly to him as she walked forward. There was a pile of hay in the corner of the stable. Nancy felt under it. In a few moments, her fingers encountered something soft, and she pulled out a bundle of white material. She carried it outside and closed the gate behind her. "The Phantom costume!" Bess exclaimed as Nancy shook out the filmy cloth. "It's Japan silk, a very thin material used for theatrical effects," Nancy told the girls. She tucked the cloth into her saddlebag. "The stable looks old," Bess remarked. "I don't think the gang built it." "You're right," Alice exclaimed and pointed to a barely discernible heart scratched on the gate. Then Valentine's hideout must be near here," Nancy said. As the girls looked around, Nancy noticed a huge rock jutting from the far end of the parapet. With a thrill of excitement, she recognized the lookout point. "We're on top of the cliff houses," she exclaimed. "Let's get the wood ready for the fire and start searching for the treasure." Beyond the lookout rock, the girls could see a grove of trees. They rode over and tethered their horses. The wind moaned through the fir trees, and Nancy shivered. She took her sweater from the saddle horn, and threw it over her shoulders. It was nearly dusk, so the girls hung flashlights on their belts. Then they collected wood for the signal fire and carried it to the lookout rock just as the sun set. Nancy was the last to make her way off the rock. To one side of it was a short flight of worn steps going down to the top row of cliff apartments. Nancy was about to lead the descent when she heard the howl of a coyote. She stopped short. "What's the matter?" asked Alice. "Shh, listen." Everyone froze. "I hope that's a real coyote," said Nancy. Bess gasped. "You mean Shorty?" "If the gang has discovered our ruse, they may have backtracked and traced us here," George said. Nancy nodded. "We'd better not turn our lights on." Hugging the parapet, the girls went down the steps to the narrow walk which ran in front of the apartments. To their left was a sheer drop-off. For a moment they stood still, breathless at the height and the silence. Suddenly there came a thump from the first room. Bess grabbed George's arm, and Alice gasped. Quietly, Nancy stepped into the open doorway and peered into the gloom. A man was lying on the floor.